Всем привет, сейчас презентация.
Hello everyone, and we're waiting for the presentation to show on the screen. Okay, here we are.
Еще раз всем привет.
Once again, hello everyone, and today I will make a trip on the obfuscated assembler. My name is Vladimir.
Я занимаюсь реверс инжиниринг.
I'm doing the reverse engineering starting from 2016. I was a forensic and also was doing the commercial software, and now I'm working for 4 years in solar company where I'm dealing with the malware,
Руковожу группой
and I'm head of the group
анализа
of analysis of the imported code. What I'm going to speak about.
написано с одной из сторон
On the one hand, it's been described in 2 articles, in 2 parts in our 4S blog. Besides, some of the tools I covered in 2023, how they could be applied
поэтому сегодня
practically. Therefore, today there will be now technical details, and also will not share any one-size-fits-all methodology how to reverse the malware with obfuscation. But I'd like to show you my way, my journey, why I took certain decisions, why I'll be using this or that approach, and I will show some memes and quote some people. And as I said, we're not like that. So what I wanted to say about that, don't give a fish, but give a fishing rod. And for instance,
про него читал, слышал.
have you ever heard about Malprotect? When I started dealing with the questions of obfuscation, I would find a lot of articles, including the popular ones that, for instance, we
Находил
deobfuscated
уже не работают. Почему?
mprotect,
Это эволюционирует.
and now it's okay, but mprotect evolves,
Основой своей
and
вот эти вот,
certainly
инструменты
all
и
those tools and instruments and methodologies are underlined by the same approach, just they are being used differently. And these are the approaches that I'm going to speak about, the approaches that are used there. I think that this is a more common thing, which is applicable in different
в
cases,
том числе и с теми, которые
including the ones that are going to run in your real life. And before we start,
у вас попросить,
I would like to ask you,
кто
raise your hands, those who heard about
тем, что такое обфускация.
Packer, who know what obfuscation and defuscation is about.
Спасибо.
Okay, thank you so much.
Все началось 2 года назад.
It all started 2 years ago.
Тогда нам на одном из инцидентов попался сэмпл, который изначально ушел на анализ.
We ran into one sample that one of my colleagues has to analyze. The very idea was in order to identify the functionality, the series, or the family, and to answer the question what it is about. And he was not dealing with how the Packer is working, he was just reaching the goal. And it took him about 5 years in order to unpack that. And inside there was just a stiller, and I'm putting it like that because the functionality was very scarce. It was stealing some data, sporadic data, from Chrome and would put in some folder. And similarly 5 days in order to say that the functionality is quite weak, is no good. And then I was rushing to somehow deal with something obfuscated, but that case gave me this opportunity, because now I got an opportunity to somehow, in future, accelerate the packaging of that Packer and to get some life hacks how to do that better. And ideally, it was a quite difficult idea in order to make my own Packer for fun. And I made my first mistake there. I thought that being armed with ID Pro and probably ID Python, I would immediately defeat that Packer, but no. And there were many stages ahead of me before I could unpack the Packer to say how it works and to unpack the payload. When I got the sample for analysis, certainly I opened that in EDIA. And as far as actually I said that we'll show to you my journey, let us start with that. Entry point showed that there's a GMP instruction or guidance. And actually it was stored somewhere in the memory. If you look deeper, you will see some pattern, which is catching the eye that there is some useful guide, and there is a jump, and there is another guide, another jump. And here I run into the very first bus. This is a GMP instruction or a guideline. And if we look broad at that situation, you will see that then that pattern, useful guidelines and a jump with some sporadic 3 bytes, they are divided into some base blocks. So the guidelines, which were in the original software, they are divided just this way. And then it seemed to me that they are spread in some accidental spaces in the memory. Apart from such obfuscation, there was a multi-step coding, and every stage would be coding the previous stage without adding any new logics. So I just saw that another stage has been deciphered or decoded, and that's it. And one of the latest TJ would decode big chunks of function, which would unpack the payload, some methods in terms of detecting the debugging and sandbox, etc. And a very important nuance there is that the key will be generated proceeding from the code that is decoding next stages. So it means that I cannot use the software entry points. Don't know how they are implemented. Well, actually, for the rest, let me explain. Once actually you use a debugging, then actually those stop points or the breakpoints would make a break when the software actually is running the guideline. It would be intercepted by the debugger, but the debugger would not show that the memory has been changed. If we put a breakpoint, it means that we are changing the key, and it means that we will not see our payload and further guidelines. And besides, you cannot use the hardware breakpoints, but that was a rare case and there was just some checks. Therefore, without thinking twice, I decided that why not doing emulation instead of using the debugger. I opted for Unicorn, and emulation works like that. We are uploading some bytes, some data, some guides, and in essence we get a full control over the situation at hand. So it means that we can change any time the memory, the values in the register. We can jump from one point to another point, and you can log that. And that was quite cool. Besides that, Unicorn was familiar to me. And as far as this is an emulation, I don't have to think about further coded stages. I just run the emulation, and next stages would be decoded, and I make a track. I enjoy my life and do not think about unpacking or anything like that. But I didn't use the Unicorn itself, but I used the wrapping FlyAM, which helps to distribute in the memory those segments of the executed file that are available. So I'm just upload that file to that program and do the emulation. I make the track, and that's it. And besides that, very often I'm using FlyAM in order to decipher some lines in Obfuscate or Harbor or anywhere else, because there are life hacks, for instance, copying of the memory, comparison, etc. And besides that, there is an opportunity to turn to the name of the function directly.
Итак, инструмент я выбрал, и как же я его применял?
And so how I use that tool? So I upload, as I said before, the executive file.
Дальше собираю трассу, ее фильтрую. Здесь я еще накладываю.
And I do filtering, and I introduce some execution, and Unicorn helps to limit not by execution, but for instance by certain addresses, so indicating the addresses within which I'm going to execute something, or at least the emulator would do that, and then it would stop the emulation. I'm sticking to the guideline because I do not know the right addresses, and I make the trace, and I make the executive file, and out of the filter trace to the PE route is very difficult, at least for me, and I'm not going to tell you more about that, fortunately or unfortunately. Then I upload that and see what happens. Suddenly I had to do some debugging, and everything is quite standardized, and sometimes I would put the trace into the text file in order to find some errors, to understand that we need better instructions or guidance, guidelines. And sometime later, eventually I would get not what I wanted to see, and I thought that IDLE would recognize that as a function, but in essence GMP guide was hacked thanks to eQuern, and then doing some research. I actually identified that there are some unclear predicates. Do you know what it is about?
Неявные предикаты — это такой вид обфускации, который добавляет ложный вид влияния.
This is actually a kind of an obfuscation. When we have an execution flow, and here we add some conditional transition, which is terminated, either it is false or it is non-false, and we generate another branch. Sometimes that transition might be positive or false, and then the second false branch would be generated proceeding from the main branch, which was just be. It would be obfuscated or complemented to understand that these are the same patterns. How it was implemented here? It was done on a binary level, therefore no one had to think about setting up that false branch, and would jump to some nearby place in the memory. So disassembler would collapse because of that. Here I show that, for instance, we have two labels, some jumps, one to the beginning of the guide, E09, that's another jump right to the middle of the guide all of a sudden. Besides that, sometimes those are non-evident or implicit predicates are introduced so that at first glance you cannot understand whether it is terminated or not terminated. So here they just take the previous guide, and regardless of the operator of that instruction, you can understand whether there would be a jump or not. And the main tool in order to combat implicit predicates, that's the symbol execution. I will elaborate on that a bit later. So it looks like emulation, but instead of the new emulator, when everything has been executed, you get a mathematical formula and can ask some questions. For instance, at what entry parameters of that function I would reach this or that branch. Or I can learn when entry parameters have to be obtained in order to get some specific value. It works very well once we have a very simple hash function, for instance, which is being used in some write-nick in order to obfuscate some functions that have been sent by the server. And the primitive execution is needed in order to get some hash tags. But in our case, in my case, I ask a question whether we can reach this branch at all. It would be enough to perform two functions, and I opted for Triton because actually it's written on C and this works much faster. And I symbolize all the registers, so it means that by default all the symbol engines are working with symbols, not with the variables, so to say. And to symbolize a register or some memory cell, it means that you tell a symbol engine that you have to perceive that as a variable, and you can use some mathematical formula instead of that. After that, I execute that in Triton, and Triton would advise me whether there will be always a jump, and depending on the situation, for instance, either I would make that conditional transition or I would replace that with the unconditional transition. Okay, we do have that rationale, that logics, and I build this way. After I assemble the traces, why? Because emulation always would go the right way. The emulation by nature is emulating the processor, where the CPU, and CPU always works the right way. I don't have to get into the emulation process, and I can filter the tracing after I assemble the traces. So this is in addition to the tracing, to filtering. And here I get it. That's an executable file that I can embed any way I want. And suddenly I got shivers as if I addressed a very difficult problem and got a flag. So why I opted for the emulation? So there's a multi-step coding was ciphering, as I said, encoding. Emulation certainly was a big help, and emulation helped me to do that. The breakpoints that I didn't have to use, again, it doesn't matter because that's an emulation. And another takeaway, for me, it helped me to debug the decoding script, which helped me later on. That algorithm of decoding, I met it several times further on in that packer. Here I added Triton, and for instance, the implicit predicates were defeated. But here I run into another problem, just a big deal of different functions I had to deal with. And why this is a problem? Because when we're approaching big deal of different functions which are being executed by the code, either have to emulate the code from the very beginning, because the memory, the emulator, and the register would matter. Otherwise, I would get non-complete covering all the functions. So there would be a check whether the indicator is 0, and I would be dropped from the function. So instead of function, I would just get out of the function, would be dropped from the function. So I tried to keep the emulator's status from point to point. I wanted to guess it right, but it was of no help. And that problem has become very critical for me. But who I am to actually argue against Statham, and I moved forward. So I started implementing my own algorithm using Pepstone. So I ran into the following problems. First of all, I had to decipher the code on my own. It was not a problem, because at the moment I had a deciphering script or decoding script, and I got an executable file with all the functions, but they were obfuscated. It was very unpleasant to look at them. And besides that, there were some implicit predicates, and I had an algorithm how to bypass them. And removing GMP guides, this is not a logical way, because they may be used for the good purposes as well. It means that we had to find some logics as to what GMP functions could be removed and what should not be removed. And here, it occurred to me, I tried to draw all the graphs where GMP instructions where guides could be used. And certainly, I didn't consider the GMP transitions that are being used as arguments, some variables or some area of the memory. So I look at the jumps to some labels. There's a rationale. The GMP transitions which are good, they always would refer to the guide with 2 or more Pietkovs. And following from that, I could do something. And certainly, it cannot be proven mathematically, and I drew several graphs that would deny that. And I thought that probably it would be okay, but unfortunately now, again, I had to deal more with that, and eventually I de-obfuscate the code itself, and this is an assembler view of the function. So one of the nodes, for instance, the left-hand side, it actually gets the references from other nodes as well. decompiled way, a view looks like that, for instance. That's the end of one conditional transition, and the function is returned, and subsequently we see that there is another functionality there. So it means that I have a full coverage of the code, similarly. Eventually, with the time, I confirmed by empirical data that the full coverage of the code was obtained, but I accelerated the work because emulation works too long, especially when we run into cycles. When I reached the moment when I had to decode big pieces of code, then certainly the emulator would work too long, very slow. And I upgraded my skills of building algorithms. I remembered my past when I did some programming. So I replaced Unicorn with a capstone that helped me to cope with all those functions. A few words about debugging, and certainly it was the same except for one thing. I'm working with the GraphFlow offer running, so it means that the graph could be visualized. I took Gephi model and would upload the whole trace, all the graph flows that I would be building, the initial ones, the ones which are purged from GMP functions. And here you can see, once you see arrows, that there is a bigger cycle, less cycle. This is the main routine to decode other stages. And as an example why, it helped me not only to visualize the graph, but also to find some logical mistakes in the process of purging these graphs from unnecessary instructions. Every summit there is one individual guide, and the transition from one summit to another summit, one peak to another peak, this is actually how we proceed from one guide to another guide. If it is GMP transition, it means it is preceded by some GMP guide, conditional, non-conditional transition, etc. There should not be a case when we are proceeding to one guide using two flow transitions, because we cannot keep in mind two guides. Either this is a type of an obfuscation that allows for that, enables that. If we look at that more attentively, then there is really one GMP transition which is indicated as a flow transition, and it impacted how we upload the flow into the executable file. Very often I would run into the false conclusions and how the function works. But before proceeding with the takeaways, let me make some comments on the sidelines. For instance, these would be useful for the developers. Let me start with saying that all those patterns are united into the baseline units that are stored somewhere in the memory, and they are localized. What it means? There was never a case when I would find some unit or some block from one function in the middle of other functions. Why it played into my hands? Because in ID, I could open that file, and there would be some implicit predicates, and if you purge that, then I can ask ID to define the function, and there would be some GMP transitions that get some bytes inside, and still it would take the function and decompile that. And once we decompile that, I do not see any conditional transitions. So for me, it would be much more difficult if those blocks or units are somehow dispersed in the memory. Besides that, that GMP transition pattern repeated for the implicit predicates as well. What I mean? Instead of the payload, you will never find that implicit predicate would be on the place of the GMP transition. So using that pattern, you can identify whether that conditional transition is non-conditional. Conditional transition is a predicate or not. So
Ну и, конечно, зависимость...
Yeah, and certainly, the dependence of the conditional transitions on the previous guides, and it simplified my life. Usually in such situations, people try either to use some global variables or some sophisticated mathematic formulas. And here it was enough in order to execute the previous guide before the conditional transition. That's it. Yes, I had some plans, some unwishful thinking, and I thought I would cope with that packer within a couple of weeks, and eventually it took me months, a month and a half. I thought I would get a fully deobfuscated packer, but I failed. And also, I didn't make the full unpacker, so that I say some utility and I put some packed file and get unpacked file. But I managed to get the unpacked file, which is made with imported elements. Why? Because we need more time. And when I was a student, I got such an idea that, for instance, if you are doing some push things, then it is a cool thing to do, but it is not so, because the life is harder for us. You have to find why those results are useful. So those results are not very much useful. Let me explain why. The very idea was to get some life hacks, to understand how in future you could unpack those packers in an easier way, faster. And I actually wrote a whole article about that, and besides, I came up with the following conclusions. Well, making a full obfuscator is not a very grateful thing. Most likely you would get some scripts or some life hacks that would help you eventually at one moment of time to understand the logics. And the time you spent on that script actually is much more than just doing that manually. And again, for debugging, not always you can use the debuggers, but you can use also some interesting tools and instruments. This was my journey. So, completing that journey only this way, I managed to cope with that packer. I cannot say that in the very beginning I did it bad, that I used an emulator. In the very beginning it helped me a lot. And probably if I were deassembling that using Capstone, still it would be much slower, because I had to replicate E-code, where would replicate or copy-paste some things from the emulator. Initially, I didn't think about certain things, but it helped me to understand something much better and much faster. Why, actually? I'm telling you that 2 years, from 2 years ago, although it happened 2 years ago, because we ran into a very difficult sample that we analyzed, and we didn't run into that anymore. Fortunately, unfortunately, this is really true, and making unpacker or full deobfuscate doesn't make sense, because we already had the unpacked file. And I had some tips as how to unpack that file, and it seemed to be quite enough. I thought there would be more scripts, and I would disclose that topic fully, but no. So I'm done with my presentation. Thank you so much. In our blog, you can find more technical details. In 4 Rays, our Telegram channel, we're telling more about the cyber attacks that we are facing right now, and my Telegram to get in touch if you want to communicate. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm ready to take your questions. Okay then. Well, so the organizer has gone. That obfuscate, in essence, was a commercial packer, and the article tells us about that, but we didn't use the commercial use of that packer. As for the labor cost, actually, it took me a lot of efforts, and probably this is not the latest version of that packer. And I just think that initially they went step by step, making it more difficult to analyze that code. This is not mProtect, but compared to mProtect, for instance, it has less limitations in terms of the resources that you are using that are needed for protection.
Да.
Yes, yes.
Можете переформулировать, может быть?
Can you rephrase that? I just failed to understand your question.
Насколько мне известно, то
As far as I know,
искусственный интеллект это больше про
artificial intelligence, it is more about the scales or weights and data, but they're very rational of using those weights for a different.
может быть написано в виде компилированного языка.
It can be executed as the interpretable language, not executable. So, and this is a totally different thing, and it's very difficult for me to compare those things.
Сколько смог?
Well, I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
Кого? Да.
Yes.
У вас было такое мнение, что достаточно просто собрать, провести динамический анализ, собрать трассы, посмотреть, как вообще январь шумит, и тогда, вопрос с обходом обфускации немножко бы отпал.
Ну, я в самом начале рассказал, что моему коллеге потребовалось 5 буквально дней, а я...
So, as I said, it took about 5 days.
У него задача была в том, что...
It took my colleague 5 days in order to do that, and it took me months and a half. And
Не нужно было анализировать...
he didn't have to analyze fully that obfuscation.
Верно говорите. Но у меня-то была задача в том, чтобы...
But my idea was
сократить это время,
to reduce that time from 5 days to a little bit more than an hour. And therefore, I wanted to deep dive, to delve deeper into Packer. So I put such an objective forward to me. So certainly, if you have to consider the functionality, then you don't have to do all those stages. But there is another thing.
разные защиты.
There are different types of protection from analysis, including the dynamic analysis.
Например, не видим какого-то
And for instance,
мелкий, то вдруг там что-то скрывается больше, чем просто...
if we see some noise, then probably there is just something more than ping C2.
исследовать обфускацию.
And therefore, probably it would make sense to study the obfuscation.
Да, конечно, была. Просто здесь в рамках доклада я рассказывал именно про...
So in the framework of my report, I spoke about obfuscation.
способов
And there were many ways of
песочницы, детектирования
detecting the sandboxes, some virtual machines, and some hardware breakpoints, etc., etc.
там, в блоге я вроде должен был описывать этот момент.
Спасибо. Здравствуйте. Спасибо за доклад. Вопрос у меня такой. Был опущен момент с восстановлением PF-файла. Разобран ли он в блоге? Мне самому интересно. Вопрос, как их восстанавливать в памяти, когда они вот уже разошлись, когда оно распаршено.
Well, once we parse that and it's been used by the memories, how we reassemble that afterwards. Okay, let me remember.
Я там писал точно о том, как сдампить PE-шник. Ну, там не PE, конечно, там...
So sadly, this is not about PE.
Но тем не менее...
There were no headlines, but nevertheless,
написал. Единственное, там проблема есть с импортом.
there is only problem. So about the import, because it builds its own table of imports, and you have actually to spend time on that, but nevertheless.
Более подробного разбора там этого вопроса не было.
Да.
But
Хорошо, спасибо.
there was no more detailed analysis about that.
Пусть напишет.
So I was asked to ask you to write more about that.
Да, вот это вот все расследование, исследование, вот эти все находки.
So these investigations in life hacks certainly
А вот именно с
are
точки зрения
quite
вашей
useful,
работы,
but in terms of your work,
куда это потом можно выгрузить? Ну, в
where
плане
actually you can
помимо
use that apart from
какого-нибудь, помимо хранилища знаний,
some
где-нибудь еще
repository of
используется
knowledge?
вот
Are
эта
you
вот
using those tips anywhere else?
информация,
So that
которая
information that
со статистического разбора
you
вот,
got from that
производится?
investigation, from that analysis?
Мы стараемся все интересные случаи выкладывать.
We try to actually analyze all those interesting cases in our blog. We're publishing different materials about the activity that we see, what cyber attacks are there, and speaking about the hands-on application, then certainly we share those practical cases as well. So,
Уже сейчас
I mean that
есть
already now there are some intellectual systems.
как-то это можно интегрировать?
Can we integrate that
Не
somehow?
могу представить себе как,
I cannot imagine how we can do that, but just a question. Probably we can do that eventually. There are different platforms, and in the context, for instance, we start doing that.
ну то есть типа ИОКи такие.
So the lights are okay.
Блоги, статьи.
Всё.
There are some blogs, there are some articles. Yep.
Я так понял, что больше вопросов нет.
I understand there are no more questions then. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Все, начинаем. Я заранее прошу прощения
I
за...
apologize for my voice because actually it has become hoarse,
Я с этим пытаюсь
but
что-то
I try
сделать.
to do something about that, although as to no
О
avail.
чем я хочу сегодня поговорить?
Something that I'm going to tell you about. I'm going to speak about the security of the remote control industrial systems. Now, a few words about myself.
Я уже 15 лет
For 15 years, I celebrate when I see any hardware, any pieces of systems, and to try to have that. And besides, I'm running the Positive Lab, that space where you are in now.
преподавательский опыт.
I used to be a professor for 10 years. I was a professor at Bauman University also. I wrote a book, Reverse of Engineering Systems.
Реверсом embedded
Those who are interested in that topic and who are the beginners, I recommend it to you because actually this is for the beginners, for dummies.
Если вы, например,
For the immersion, for instance, once you are doing the reverse but do not know how to approach the reverse of hardware.
так, а о чем, собственно, у нас доклад?
And what my presentation would be about? My presentation would be about such things.
Шли мы даже если такой.
And
Я с ребенком,
once I was walking with my kid and I saw how the people were unloading the
там никого не удивил.
stones, and that manipulator is of no surprise, but any time I would be seeing such manipulator. Next to that, there was some guy who would be pulling some leverages, and here I saw a remote control, and most importantly, I didn't see the wire that would connect the remote control and the vehicle itself, so it was a remote one. Then I got interested whether it is a remote control, whether it is protected very well or not. So you remember I said that I celebrate every time that I see any hardware. And as far as I'm too far away from the construction equipment, I decided to look where it's being used, and such vehicles are being used anywhere.
Портовые краны.
Such port hoisters, cranes at different enterprises, manipulators for the concrete pumps, etc. So, and it would be great actually to move 50 meters away in order to see how actually the crane operates and where, for instance, the concrete would be put.
И
This is a kind of an application that I can highlight, and certainly was not the first, which was humiliating.
в 2019 году сделали
Tried Micro made a research, and they published the results on the internet in terms of the security and safety of those systems, which were not great for the vendors. They looked at the market, they looked
систем,
at lots of systems, they selected them,
кратенько результаты, которые
and these are the results that they obtained.
безопасности нет.
So there is no safety, there is no security at all.
Несколько видов атак.
They wanted to initiate several attacks to make a replay attack. That's the easiest way. For instance, then to disintegrate the protocol and to insert their own commands. Then they wanted to make a command of is stop. So, for instance, in such remote controls, there is a red button which you push, and immediately everything would stop because it means that something goes wrong.
Они хотели сделать
They wanted to
злонамеренное
make
перепривязывание пульта
an
и также
modified
цепочку поставок с тем,
connection of the remote control to another system, and they decided to see whether you can reprogram the
прикольно же, например,
remote control. Because, for instance,
прилетает такая-то
if
берется внутренний флеш,
certain parcel gets in, then the internal flash would work appropriately.
команда инвертирует.
Well, for instance, the command would be inverted, so you can do whatever you want by means of attacking the supply chain or modified reprogramming. So I actually got disappointed because I thought that this is a totally unprecedented topic, a unique one, and I decided to look at what is available in the market 2024. And sadly, primarily, I was interested in the Russian market, but then once I made a vision of the Russian market, I looked at what is available internationally.
Оказалось, что
It turned out that the vendors, sadly the ones who actually analyzed the Tried Micro, they are still there, but in the Russian market the situation is totally different. Many of those vendors, they left the Russian market. There are Chinese vendors,
эти китайские вендора
and those Chinese vendors are not just some local ones, but global ones, which are being sold from Amazon, for instance, or anywhere else. And they're sold to 60, 70, 80 countries of the world. So despite the fact that the cost is, the price is quite low, this compared to some European manufacturers,
оказалось, что
it turned out that
рынок и здесь.
China is conquering the market here as well, and at the same time, China certainly is stealing the bread from the Chinese manufacturers, meaning that they make replicas of the Chinese solutions. This is what we run into once we were buying a solution for ourselves, because it's very difficult to understand what it is. So the price is the same, it looks the same, and once actually you buy that, you understand that it's not Chinese-made, but it is Chinese-made. So it is adulterated Chinese product. And we wanted to look at the branded Chinese product and what we want to check, what we want to verify. We have the same wishes as TradeMinder had initially, but we did a different grouping. First of all, we'd like to interfere with the work of the control system. Gestop, not Gestop, but just break the work. Secondly, intercept the operation so that the remote control doesn't work at all. Then we actually change the firmware of the receiver of the remote control. And for instance, to physically destroy something, what I mean by physical destruction. For instance, you have a receiver, a signal, and once you send such a signal that would execute a code, then in essence, your device would turn into a brick. So the question is, can we remotely, locally, so to say, being at a distance from those devices, for instance, 500 meters away, send something, some command, that it stops being a device at all, turning into a brick. So we started, the first device that we got was Yuting Telecontrol. There is such a company which was analyzed by the original investigator. This is a telecontrol. Telecontrol, this is the very good clone. In essence, the solutions are the same, and so they replicated that, but they started developing and they evolved into their own brand. They are 22 years old already, and they are in the low-end price segment, about actually $100–500 per one set. They produce about 60,000 sets a year, and certainly they supply that to the international markets, so to the North America and to other countries of the world. And besides, starting from the simple solutions and simple remote controls where actually there would be single buttons, then the buttons that you have to press 2 times, and the anti-explosive ones. So the number of models, the range of models is the same as from other vendors. We selected 2 models, F21 and F24, just as the basic ones, and actually the basic from the good ones, so to say. It turned out that they all are 133 megahertz. They all have 127 channels. And actually, they can reach 100 meters distance and have the security key. If you look at the lower part of the orange remote control, there is a white label, so that's a magnet in essence. So without that, the remote control will not work, that's true. But on the other hand, for instance, it doesn't provide any security. I don't see any RFID or anything like that. And for Chinese, actually, it is even funnier. So there is a magnet, but there is no gear cone. So gear cone was not supplied, and it means that the remote control works without the key anytime. 127 channels. An interesting thing, there are different versions. The old version, which is called Crystal, and the new version, which has no name at all. The old version, Crystal, they changed the frequency, because only when you would dismantle the remote controller, and you would have to buy a quartz and replace the quartz. We bought Crystal series and the updated version, and they look the same, despite that one says Crystal and it doesn't have any crystal. They are absolutely the same. So let's dismantle it and see what is inside. Inside you see a lot of miracles, wonders of the Chinese engineering. So a Kung Fu CPU, I've never seen that before, and there is a Comostec transmitter, so you can find that somewhere at least. It is not unique. And there is a writer port.
На приемнике.
So on the receiver, you have microcontroller, Kunfu, and Gmostek receiver. So the device is very simple, and there should be nothing difficult about that. When datasheet looked at the receiver and transmitter, and they are called like that, and they are really transmitter and receiver, so there is nothing two-way communication. So the remote control will never understand that the receiver is not switched on, for instance. That was the first alarm that would be too simple. But remember, and we decided to look at the 24th series, so it is just a clone, the same number of elements. The only thing that the transmitter is of a senior series, Quasnek one. But in terms of the receiver, it is the same. So the microcontroller is the same and the receiver is the same. And I don't know whether it was bought from the warehouse or actually it occurred to them that it would be good to make a two-way street, so to say.
О том, что приемник и передатчик был
That the receiver and transmitter could match each other and communicate to one another, and do not know. And there has to be some mutual communication protocol. And remember, I spoke about writer. There are two types of devices. One is called copier, which looks like a remote control. It would be connected to that very connector. And you push the button, connect Gerkona to read the parameters, and actually you put that closer to Gerkona with another device, and it would write the configuration to the remote control and not make a number of the same remote controls. And we didn't like that because it smells like actually it would be undermining the security architecture. There is also a data cable that you can use in order to connect that through USB to a computer. There is a software. The most recent one is 2019, and you can set any buttons. And funny enough, we didn't actually didn't manage to match the software and the receiver. So probably we are not skillful enough, but that's it. It didn't impact the results of the investigation, but I have a feeling that through that connector, especially Nitro said that they did an experiment in order to hack that using that very connector. We got interested how the information exchange looks like between the receiver and transmitter, and sadly, we could make an NSDR radio to analyze that and guess something, but this is just a simple SPI. You can get it connected to a logical analyzer and get the data a guaranteed way. This is what we did. For those who do not know what SPI is, this is a sequential, consistent interface. The speed is about units of megahertz, and certainly there are faster ones. But the industrial solution would be using about 500 kilohertz. And it's been analyzed by the cheapest logical analyzer. And we sniffed several devices, and we realized that actually initialization of that connection between the receiver and transmitter and the chip helps to set a lot of parameters, preamble and other parameters. They are the same for all the devices. The only thing which differs, that's the number of the channel. On the label, actually, you see the channel number 72. So it would be written in the register of Mostek, which is called channel. So in terms of radio, everything is very unified, very easy, very simple, and streamlined between all the devices. And even it is streamlined between the series 21 and 24. So that Quastek is everywhere. So, okay, this is up to them, but probably there is something different on the protocol level. And we looked at how the starting package looks like when you push the button start, and when the
Передатчик связывается с приемником.
transmitter matches with the receiver, and there are 4 different packages from different devices. And within armed
Даже XOR.
you see that there is no
Различающихся
protection at all, and C byte that would be different also are not numerous. So the only difference is about the ID of the
если вы параметры
instrument of the device. If you know the parameters of the radio channel,
то
and this is something that you can determine on your own, it means that you have sniffed everything and you
как выглядит
have everything. So this is how all those packages look like. It turned out immediately that further on it won't be so interesting. And what would be not so interesting? So the line of the package is fixed,
нужно поставить
and you have just to put in the 10 byte, the third byte equal 1,
приемник.
so that the receiver believes that it starts working. And then, from time to time, you have to send a release package, release packet, in order to keep the connection, because all the transmitters on all the receivers
Отключение
by default should actually switch off once the connection is lost.
ожидает постоянно
So it can be done
например, там, не
only if the receiver is expecting some packet with some frequency, and if certain packets have not been received, it would believe that the transmitter is out and it would get disconnected.
пока так.
So in essence, it
Ну и
works like
на
that.
самом деле, заснифав все кнопки,
And sniffing all the buttons, it became obvious that
грубо говоря, интересного нет.
there is nothing interesting about that. So
Битовая кнопка кодирует
just bit-based button, which could be coded with its own bit, and either it would require a full pressing or half of the pressure,
emergency stop кнопка.
and the emergency stop button is
Геркона и
also there.
это одно и то же.
And Girkon and emergency stop is the same thing for that system.
Послав такой пакет,
And sending that packet,
симулировать нажатие
you can simulate the pushing of the emergency stop, and the signal from the original remote control will never be received.
Тут, кстати, есть интересный момент.
And there is an interesting thing.
Системы, которые мы рассматривали. Забегая вперед, скажу, что их
The system that we analyzed, there are 3 of them. We analyzed
что они
them, and we saw that
некоторые имеют фиксированную частоту обмена.
some of them have fixed frequency of exchange. Others would change the frequency of exchange, depending on what buttons are pressed. For instance, if you
Быстрее работает. Если
just press the button only half
начинает работать.
way, actually, it doesn't work so fast. If it is pressed fully, then it would be working much faster.
Пиковый трансмиттер.
So once we assembled our fake transmitters,
Берем такой же передатчик с AliExpress.
we take the original one, the one that we bought from AliExpress, and we see that the receiver actually gets that much faster a bit later, and we'll tell you how it could be used in practice.
Ну что, у нас
Okay.
нарушить работу системы мы точно можем.
We certainly can distribute, we can interfere with the work of the system, we can intercept the control.
Или физически.
And actually, 2 objectives left are about the upgrading of the firmware and physical destruction. So this is the very first microcontroller that I saw in my life like that, and certainly there are no debuggers for such microcontrollers. It has its own debugger,
Называется Kung Fu
which is called Kung Fu
P1.
KFDPA1,
Он продается
and
только
it
в
could
одном
be bought from AliExpress, only from one shop, unfortunately. It was bought, it was delivered, and we got connected,
И увидели,
and we
что
saw
конфигурация
that the configuration
у этого микроконтроллера
of that microcontroller
есть параметры.
is not singular, so there are some security parameters that could be set, hash protection, for instance, and
Фотографии.
there might be some cryptography,
Страны. Прям
and
с китайской документацией.
it contains Chinese documentation and SDK, and probably you can live with that, but why?
Соответственно, прошивка была считана.
So we got that firmware,
Отвечая на вопрос,
but
можно ли
answering the
что-то
question whether we can send anything specifically
прошивке, чтобы его-
to that firmware so that it could be destroyed physically.
Сходу не нашлось.
Well,
Честно говоря,
we didn't get anything on top of my head, but we didn't want to deep dive into that, so it is not an interesting thing. It's too easy.
что приемника
But besides, as I said, the receiver processes the signals much faster than the original transmitter transmit the signal. We did some testing and turned out that those relays that are installed on the receiver could be
в 5 Гц.
used for 25 Hertz. changing the
Если
values.
так прощелкать 27
And
часов,
if you do that for 27 hours, then
срабатывание,
actually
валится. Скорее всего,
those transmitters have a guarantee for 27 hours, where 1 million such things, and so we can do that. And
штатный передатчик
bearing in mind that this is Chinese made, within 24 hours, the transmitter's relays would
способный вид.
fail.
Было слишком просто.
But it was too easy.
Мы уведомили Сенсерт,
And we notified the vendor about that.
отправили в репорт после
We sent a report.
Сенсерт нам ответил, что
After CNCERT said that they are in touch, then, as usually happens
китайскими вендорами мы пытались
with the Chinese vendors, we wanted to get some feedback, what is going on. And
3 апреля
on April 23,
сказали, что вендор устранил баги.
CERT told us that the vendor did debugging, but there will be no more comments. And we said, okay, we trust you,
Идем дальше.
so let's move forward.
Мы решили взять что-нибудь
We decided to take something non-Chinese
что несмотря
out of what Trend Micro
на
didn't analyze and what is available in the Russian market. This is the Turkish system called Elfatec.
от 5
It is actually more expensive, ranging from $500 to $2,500. We do not know how many sets they are selling, but they have a lot of pictures of their office, of their production, and that means that it seems that they are selling a lot, and they're selling that to 21 countries, 121 countries.
естественно, сертифицировано везде, где
And this is certified anywhere you want, and we bought something more powerful. We wanted to play with those joysticks.
2,4 гигагерца.
So it operates 2.5 gigahertz, and besides, Gearcon is used as the security key. So let's have a look at that.
Немножечко получилось порадоваться.
So we celebrated that because it is assembled much better, it is more quality,
Пользуется PIC 18
and they are using PIC 18. Raise your hands whether you
версию.
have reversed
Коллеги,
the PIC 18 assembler.
в
No.
качестве приема-передатчика
Okay.
используется NRF. Притом
This is NRF, an old one, which is being used as a transmitter and receiver, and therefore
но не все так.
it
В приемнике
told us that it would be quite easy,
немножечко
but
другой пик.
quite not so. That's a little bit different PIC, and the same NRF. NRF has a well-known for 12 years an attack using sniffing
Того же самого
with the help of the same NRF. We are not speaking about SDR.
трафик перехватить.
So intercepting the traffic is possible.
Мы собрали свой точно так же
We made our own fake transmitter, which helps on behalf of the original receiver
переслать. Но нам
to send that, but we also needed more parameters because there was no time
когда у нас опять
we wanted to spend on sniffer. As far as we got SPI, we got connected to SPI, we analyzed
протокол.
the protocol.
Из интересного.
Out of interesting things,
У НРФ есть
NRF has channel,
минимальный размер.
and the minimum size is 3 byte of address, ranging from 3 to 5. They have 3 byte address. If you look at the label, we can see the channel,
Задается в конфигурации.
which has been set for the configuration of NRF, and there would be 2 bytes of address.
Вот этот вот десятичный
And
адрес,
because this 10-bit address is converted into 2 bits,
третий байт.
and I do not know where the 3rd byte is obtained from.
А как он получается, что-то сходу.
How we get the 3rd byte, this is something that I couldn't guess.
Потом уже, когда
Then,
была считана прошивка,
Jumped in the gun once we read the firmware.
получается перемножение
I got it that the 3rd byte is obtained once you
канала.
multiply the channel and 2 bytes of the ID. This is just very funny. Why actually they could not extend the ID or something like that. But information exchange is also one-way street, so it means that the remote control knows nothing about the receiver, although NRF allows for the two-way communication, two-way street.
Казалось,
They just didn't do that, seemingly.
протокол тоже очень
Well, protocol is very simple, 21 byte SRC16, and also there is a starting packet, and then you have to repeat the packets
со статусом.
with a status assigned to that.
Другая система.
So the system is a little bit different, so it has a status over there.
Это статус.
And this is the status, the current status.
То есть он там ушел в слип, не ушел в слип.
Whether it actually is in the sleeping mode or not in the sleeping mode.
Опять же, для того, чтобы сделать emergency stop,
In order to make an emergency stop, it would be enough to put one bit and send that with the right parameters of NRF. So it is quite easy. We did a check regarding whether you can send the request faster. Yes, you can do that packet again.
весь распарсился, немножко.
We can parse that with the buttons. The structure is a little bit different, so it means that there is a value of the key and a modifier. Nothing interesting. Okay.
Считаем опять же, что
So again,
можно спокойно вмешаться
we
в работу системы управления.
believe that we can interfere with the work of the system and we can totally hijack the operation, the control, because you can send much faster the information than the original transmitter. If you send much faster the commands that you need, the receiver would process that better,
Не влияет на то,
and it means that
по большому счету.
you can do whatever you want.
Все-таки попытаться
Then we wanted to try to reprogram it,
нам
to
заботливо оставили
change the firmware.
технологический разъем
So there is a technical connection so that we can get connected.
на приемники и
And both on the receiver and transmitter, we got connected to
начинали конфигурацию.
using BKit. We read the configuration. We saw that in essence,
Защита от записи есть.
there is a protection against recording and reading, except for
Снова
BitBlock.
вспоминается, что
And again, we remember that such an attack is quite well known, despite the fact that you can read only the content of BootBlock, and the rest, that about 2 kilobytes, and the rest of the code is not accessible because PIC operates with blocks of flash memory.
вы
But nevertheless, it means that
сделать какую штуку?
you can do the following.
Затереть.
You can erase BootBlock,
Дальше вы
you read it,
блок.
scan it, then you make your own BootBlock that through UART will give you an access to the other parts of the memory. The memory is vulnerable to such an attack, and this way you can read the whole memory. You will make actually 2 replicas and you erase everything else, and you will get the full image
Казалось,
of firmware.
что тут делать? И
So it looks quite easy, and in essence, this is something that disappoints me about the research. And you know what has to be done, and you have to do that routine, and you make the same mistakes that you didn't want to. So PKit cannot erase BootBlock. It can erase the full
Если
block.
в даташите написано,
So we looked at the datasheet, and datasheet,
вам не видно, но поверьте, там команда есть.
there is some command that you have to
Даташите
type in.
написано, какие команды
It
надо
says what
послать
commands
для
have to be
устранения
sent in order to raise BootBlock.
Соответственно, был собран свой
So
BitBang
then we
программы
made
для
our
того,
own
чтобы
BitBang
реализовать затирание BootBlock.
in order to erase the
И он
BootBlock.
прекрасно работает на
And
тестовых
it works
чипах,
very
он
well
работает
for
на
the
двум.
pilot
Дальше начали разбираться,
chips and doesn't work at the
оказалось,
target
что
one.
определенная конфигурация
It turns out that
битов,
certain bit configuration and pin configuration from that system sets the programming mode, and it is high voltage. It means that it has to be supplied with 9 volts.
В общем, ничего сложного.
So
кроме того,
nothing
что пришлось
difficult.
модифицировать. Там
But we had to
модифицировать
modify
времени
this and that in time lapses, and we're losing
эксперимент
interest
был
in that.
сделан,
But
прошивка
we did that
просчитана из
tool,
приемника, из
so
передатчика.
we changed the firmware.
Спасибо, что есть
And
Hydra, потому что
thanks
там
for
есть
Hydra, because it has the decomplete for everything, including PIC,
было полегче.
and it was an
И
easier
я
way.
нашел код
And I found a code.
передатчики, код приема.
In the transmitter, I got the code for transmitting of NRF. Why the remote control that doesn't have anything but the battery and the lamp and the indicator that it works to get the code from NRF?
Короче, проклиная пик, все
And I blamed PIC, so I reversed that, and reversed that to the extent that we got the full code, and the code rewrites the parameters. But one element is missing,
для того, чтобы код начал работать.
which is needed in order to make the code work.
Есть у меня предположение, что
I have an assumption that the extended version of the remote controls of RD series has a screen. That means that there might be some information shown on that screen, and if you buy the extended version, probably there would be two-way communication,
появляется возможность
and that means that
пульт что-то слать.
probably you can send something to the remote control to jump the gun.
Там нету
I might say what we can send to the remote control.
и так далее, но
And there are no banks when it's like that, but
которые позволяют
there are some strange parcels that can help you to erase the flash memory, and then the remote control will never be launched next time. So the experiment does not confirm that this is just a reverse, but seemingly you can remotely collapse and destroy
Окей,
physically a remote control, which is quite expensive.
все, что хотели, тоже реализовали.
Okay, we did everything we wanted.
Точно так же мы можем очень быстро щелкать
And as I
ролетку,
said, we can actually click the relays, and those relays actually can stand 1 million such moves. And
на роле. И когда их много,
once you click those big relays, 25 hertz
цикады, но
ones,
неприятный звук, очень
this would be a very unpleasant sound. And so you can do that within 24 hours.
таких неприятных.
27 hours of such unpleasant sounds,
Приемник тоже
and the receiver
у нас
would
в негодность.
collapse.
Мы пошли в турецкий СЕРТ, мы пошли в
So we
не отвечал.
reported to Elfatec and to
Сказал, что связался
Turkish T-CERT, and they got in touch with Elfasec, and they said that would render that information. Elfatec, 3 months later, got in touch with us and said, okay, we will fix everything. So there was a letter saying thank you, and we'll fix it all.
19 марта
On March 19,
а 16 мая
we published to CVE, and then
мы до этого просто пинговали, что
we just pinged them. So, meaning when you're going to fix that, and they said that we
эту информацию не рассказывать.
actually decided not to disclose that information to you, and we said, okay, okay,
Так тоже сойдет. Ну и последняя система
this is another solution.
это
And one more system that we're going to analyze, that about ECH radio, that's China, but this is very high quality
комплект
Chinese project, which costs about $4,000 per one set, and they are selling about 100,000 sets per year, and this is OEM vendor. It means that you can see it under different brands and using their own brand at the same time. So we took two systems.
3 мегагерца.
So also 433 megahertz security key, and
И вы
they have RFID as the security key with the control of integrity of the data and everything. So it looks very, very nice.
как бы
So, and
интересней.
it advised us that probably it would be more interesting case.
Взглянули,
We looked inside and look.
нормального Китая внутри стоит нормальный STM.
So there is a normal STM inside a normal Chinese product, and there are chips sets from Silicon Labs.
Это очень старый.
But that's a very old chipset and RFID reader, but inside everything looks quite nice,
Первый Китай, который
much better than the first Chinese product that we have studied.
у приемника
The receiver
ровно то же самое.
has
тот же
almost the same STM,
приемный передатчик.
the same receiver and transmitter made by Silicon Labs. Okay.
А в дорогой версии мы специально
And the more expensive version, we on purpose took a version with a screen and with a two-way communication channel, and that's the same.
ничего, собственно,
I mean, nothing special,
что сразу навело нас на мысль, что
which made us think that
передние панели
we can do the full modification, so the case may change, the series of what it is may change, but in essence, the devices themselves inside are absolutely the same.
смотришь прошивку того же
And when you look at the firmware of Emphatec,
не соврать бы, по-моему, 56 килобайт.
so it takes about 56 kilobyte, and when I saw 56 kilobyte of data,
Вроде как бы
I asked actually, what is inside? So actually you click the relays and the buttons, but what is inside? Why 56 kilobyte? Out of those 56 kilobyte, about 46 kilobyte of tables are there that they are using in order to select what this device is about.
кнопочки, как будет зажигаться на каком пине. То есть фактически есть
So in essence,
база,
there is a kind of a base, and a new device is just been added into one single firmware.
всего,
And
а потом в конфиге
so first, actually, you make a firmware for everything, and then the configuration will say that this is model like that and the button like that. But once you look at the code, that would be the same.
окей,
So not a very pleasant figure.
поехали смотреть.
So let's have a look at
Silicon Labs такой.
what Silicon Labs is about. Certainly, we found SPI and look at the piece of data sheet.
Рекомендуется для новых релизов.
And it even says not recommended for new releases.
Самый жесткий
A very old one, but in terms of initialization, this is the hardest one.
То Точно так же между двумя
With the same
разными
token, between different two devices, only two parameters would change: the number of channel
и
and
номер
the
слова.
number of sync word.
Слово полностью соответствует
And it complies, matches totally the ID on the RFID, just like the number of the channel. Okay.
Смотрите, что же за данные.
We said, let's have a look at what data is inside. 8-byte length packet, 8-bit checksum, and packet counter. I celebrated that I at least have a packet counter, although it is 1 byte only, but at least this is a counter. Let me say in advance, the packet counter is being ignored. It doesn't impact on anything, so it might be 0 or 1, whatever value, it still accepts that. So we identified that in the course of the hands-on experiment. So you send some starting packets, and then the packets that all the buttons are released. If actually you press a button, then another packet would be sent. Emergency stop also. You can send everything much faster. And third time it was not so interesting, especially once you buy that set for $4,000. And we said, okay, it is clear. We can do the same, just like we did it before. Let us just do reprogramming. So this is the STM level 2, but apart from that, there is UART. UART shows the log of what is being pushed, and in essence, we didn't even have to sniff SPI. In order to restore the protocol, it would be enough to look at the UART. But the process was streamlined, so first we sniffed the SPI and we looked at everything else. Although probably it would be the right decision to look at the UART. So UART has a log, but you just have to decode the same. And L series level 2 cannot be hacked so easily in order to read the firmware. And I can honestly say, I was lazy enough in order to do that. I thought that probably that would be enough. If you want to see something interesting that I doubt very much, and I thought that probably we would solder out some elements of that system and would use that. But now, I was too lazy to deep dive into that device. It didn't make sense to do that. In terms of non-disclosure, well, actually, we notified CNCERT, we notified the vendor CNCERT, responded and said that I will report that, but in March, we got mentioning that CNCERT tries to get in touch with the vendor, despite the fact that the vendor is big. And if you look at their website, you will see that there are very big companies that are using their products, but still the vendor fails to get in touch with the CNCERT. So this is how much they are interested in their own security. So as for the takeaways, we did everything we wanted with those devices, including the physical destruction and well, the change of the firmware, only DCH radio. This is something that we failed. And so what are the takeaways? This is not just the security fraud, but rather that there is no security tool. In the 21st century, the solutions that are being offered, and there are solutions that would cost $3,000, $4,000. The vendors are not ready to see bugs, and you may say, let you fix those bugs, but they are not interested in debugging. And the attacks against the supply chains are very much possible and viable. So you have lots of distributors across the world, and the remote controls can be opened with no seals being attached. So you can change the firmware. And most awfully, these are the things that operate some cranes, concrete pumps, etc. And well, actually, it may
физическую безопасность.
impact the physical safety of the people. When it all started, I thought that probably it would be a very interesting research, but turned out that, well, from time to time, we even had to urge ourselves to do that because we lost any interest in that. I'm done with my presentation, and thank you so much for your attention.
Спасибо. Вопросы? Кого-нибудь?
Any questions? Do you have any questions? Yes, please.
Алексей. Алло, да, сразу.
Так.
1-1. Can you hear me?
Алексей,
Говори,
ты
пожалуйста.
сказал, что 4463 это старый чип, а чё
Да.
он такой решил-то? Не особо он старый.
You said that 4364, that's an old chip. Why do you think it is old? Andrew, come again.
Сказал, что 4463
You said
это
that,
старый чип. Не особо он старый, он там пару лет всего
This is an old chip, but this is not an old one.
поставили.
They operate that for 2 years only, and before it would be used quite actively.
Претензий нет.
And I do think that there are no claims against that. No, there are no claims against that.
У них у Силаб
The only thing is that Labs has such a manner that they're making a patch.
там, видимо, какие-то выходят
For
фишки,
instance,
которые
when they fix certain bugs, then they
Не
online
проливается в этой конфигурации.
put that into the RAM. So not in that configuration. Okay, okay.
Флиппер может перехватить.
Flipper can intercept that, except for AlphaTac, it can intercept that if you tune that the right way. Set that the right way.
Прошивки не перехватит. Назову это так. На пропаченной прошивке может.
If it is a patched firmware, then you can intercept.
Назовем это так, да. Но кое-что все равно надо погнуть.
But still, you will have to bend something to hack something.
Да.
Yes, the answer is affirmative.
Он, ну, смотрите, у меня не было бетононасоса подключенного непосредственно к этой штуке.
So I didn't have a pump connected to that device. Well, actually, we look at everything in theory.
В благих намерениях. Поэтому мы не проверяли, как ведется оборудование. Но
And
что я
we
хотел
didn't
проверить,
check
что
how
я
the
проверил, и
equipment
вот это,
works.
кстати,
And what
вот
I
это
checked.
У меня было сразу
And
интересно, а что будет,
there was
если
interesting
вот
thing, what would happen
Я же не
if,
могу
for
да,
instance,
подать команду влево и вправо, да, на одном джойстике.
I cannot send the command on the right and on the left at the same time. So then in the code of the receiver, I got the check algorithm, so there is such a thing there.
Да, которая первая в пакете.
So the first in the packet, when they are parsing the packet, it would immediately go to one branch. You cannot say the engine which is connected to that rotate both to the right and to the left.
Может не успевать срабатывать, да, но...
Probably it will not catch up with that, but we spoke about the how to collapse the, how to destroy the relays. As for the equipment which has been connected to that, as far as you can simulate the commands, you can do whatever you want. It's a matter of what has been connected to that remote control.
Еще раз, задержка где? Наверное. Ну, опять же, смотрите. Ну, скорее всего, да. Но здесь, опять же, для вывода релюшек вы быстро щелкаете, да, например, а для того, чтобы сделать именно...
In order to destroy the relays, you have just to click them very fast, but in order to make some modified action with the equipment, you don't have to do that fast.
И в приемник, и в передатчик зашито...
Both the receiver and the transmitter has a configuration which is inbuilt.
Они все запейрены, грубо говоря. То есть нет такого, что вот вы там...
There is no such a case that you push the button, some button, and the pairing happens and the receiver or transmitter starts working. So telecontrol can do that. It's not made in China, but rather in Taiwan. And it was analyzed by Tride Micro. So, for instance, you push certain buttons at the same time. If you turn on the remote control, then all the transmitters and receivers would be paired if they are in the proximity, but not in that firmware. There is one more question, may I ask it? As far as the transmitters and receivers work on frequency 433, it's quite low. And you can actually poison or somehow contaminate the air with the cheap equipment. Well, in essence, that's true. You have multiple parcels, for instance, the same button. Once you push that, this is not just one parcel that's being sent, but you push the button, and with a frequency of 10 Hz, those parcels are being sent. Then the radio parameters that help you to configure the receiver and transmitter are supposed to work in a very noisy environment. So even if we try to contaminate the air, still there will be some communication between the receiver and transmitter. Well, certainly if you do that the right way, certainly the parcels would not be transmitted, would not be rendered home.
Повесили на релюшки, почему-то быстрее эти релюшки не отрабатывают. Возможно, это
So somehow those relays cannot work faster, so this is being run by the software. That with about 23 or 25, that was from AlphaTech. It was 25. So it would be sending faster, but the relays do not click faster. Do not work faster, although the packages or packets have been received. So it doesn't mean that they trigger an error, so they manage to process that, but probably something goes wrong or slow.
$5 milliwatt.
5 milliwatt. And DCH has 10 milliwatts, so this is about nothing.
Да, но я, кстати, после того...
That's true.
Да.
Yep.
Организационная безопасность и, как говорится...
That's about organizational safety, and as I put that in my presentation, clear away from the load.
Но здесь, опять же, я после того, как вот это все посмотрел, начал обращать
When I
внимание,
looked at that, I started paying attention what is being used. And for instance, I got a case with a remote control, and then all the manipulators, all those arms, they are not supplied with the remote control. So, generally speaking, probably. Some countries have those remote controls more widespread. Where, for instance, when different cranes, for instance, are being operated from the remote control, at least what I see in the Moscow street, usually there would be a guy pulling the leverages.
Там обычная RFID-метка на
That's an ordinary RFID
15 МГц.
solution for 13 megahertz.
Если там даже закрытый секторатор, там словарный пароль, потому что я
And
сразу. Вот, если честно, не помню. Вот, а там просто
I
конфигурация.
don't remember, so the configuration in essence is the same, just like EEPROM and the receiver.
Какой канал?
So it says what channel it is, it says what sync packet is,
Пакет это у них ID-шник. И конфигурация.
and the configuration of the buttons, which are also being recorded.
Он на старте считывается.
It's been read from the very beginning, from the outset.
Часть.
So the RF part would be triggered, and the buttons would be configured. For instance, when you buy
То же самое, там, не знаю, Китай, вот эти вот
Chinese products,
Эльфатек, мы покупали.
Elphatec, we bought it
стандартный, а DCH
from an original manufacturer, and DCH actually, one was an expensive one. And we were asked actually what buttons you need, actually 2 joysticks, etc. And they said that's no problem, and they did a test panel for us, so the configuration is tailored for the customer. And they do the same for the RFID tag, so that you know actually what button operates the joystick, etc., etc. Yes.
На экране у нас версия еще и с каном.
We also have a CAN version as
Экран
well.
выводится параметр CAN,
And you show the parameters of CAN on the screen.
направленный обмен.
So this is a two-way communication, but really this is actually double one-way
Я- это
communication.
разные устройства абсолютно.
So these are totally different devices.
Просто там отрисовывает на экране
And
параметры,
it would show on the screen the parameters.
параметры на экране рисуются по заранее
And
заданному шаблону, который-
it would be using some preset template, but there is nothing interesting about that. At least we didn't see anything.
Нет.
No. Okay.
Он об этом не знает.
It doesn't know it.
Да.
Okay.
Да. Да, как раз мы проверили, что он замыкается. Да.
Yes, we checked it, and
Но опять же, у нас не было исполнительного механизма.
but there was no execution mechanism, so we do not know what goes on in reality.
Да.
Yes, the answer is affirmative.
Вроде 25 Гц для реле тоже не самый...
25 Hz for a relay, this is not the fastest solution.
Реле может быстрее.
So relay can work much faster.
Еще вопросы?
More questions?
Не знаю.
I do not know.
Что у меня
I just put it.
больше там руководящие должности. Я
I'm
больше,
more a manager.
там, занимаюсь организацией работ.
I'm dealing more with the organization of the works, and this is something that I do for interest, out of curiosity.
Ты должен что-то посмотреть.
So, as my guys say, once a year you have to look at something.
Что я хочу
So
посмотреть.
once a year, I decide that I want to do something, and when I have some free time, I do that.
Поэтому пока еще не знаю.
So I do not know yet.
Все, спасибо тогда.
Are we done? Then thank you so much.